Well, kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai. Welcome to this session that we have here today as part of Grand Rounds. I've got the privilege of introducing Dr. David Tipene Leach to have his kōrero. First of all, sorry, I would just like to acknowledge Iris and Vaki Pāho, who have come along to Tautoko and support this session as well. So I'm just going to introduce Dr. David for those of you who don't know much about him. So Dr. David is a general practitioner who spent his working life promoting Māori health in rural and urban Māori communities around Ruatoki, Whakatane, Gisborne, East Coast and Hastings. Dr. David has spent the last 2 decades finding innovative approaches to addressing sudden unexpected death in infancy, including leading the design and development of wahakura and actively lobbying to obtain funding for wahakura to be provided as part of an infant safe sleep program. He's also a researcher. He's researched, published and presented widely on diabetes among Māori, which led to him being awarded a distinguished fellowship from the Royal New Zealand College of General Practitioners. Dr. David was inaugural chair of Te Ora, the Māori Medical Practitioners Association, has been a member of various medical review committees, has taught Māori health to medical students and public health to trainee medical officers, and is the chair of the Hira Tamatea Treaty of Waitangi Claim Board. In 2018, he was honoured with membership of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to Māori and health. So as you can hear, he is very well respected and has done a lot of work to actually advance the outcomes for Māori health across Aotearoa. So let's give Dr. David a big welcome.
Funny, isn't it? When you hear other people talking about you, thank you, Sherry. That was a very generous. If you make this thing work. Here we go. So, oh, you've got your thing. We're all set up here, so we've got this on Zoom, and apparently there are 700 people watching on the outside. Is that right? Oh, seven people who are also watching us, and so we've got it on Zoom, and you all know, because you're all great presenters, how it's really good to have presenter view. So I've got Harsh up here, but I'm not trying to look at that. He's going to change that, and I'm looking at my computer down here, so I know what's next. So, me mihi ka tika kia tātou. Tātou a kui nei, I roto I tēnei kaupapa nui, ko te hauora o tō tātou iwi Māori. Raki Iris tēnā kōrua, hei pakeke mo tēnei wāhanga, i nei tāngata, a hoi no aha ko taku mōho nei, no te kāinga nei, no te kāinga nei o Ngāti Kahungunu, a mea Kerry, o hoi no, Ngāti Kahungunu in the house, ka pai. So, Harsh is the one who asked me here today because apparently, oh, where are you, Sue? Kia ora, Sue. Because, and Sue's the other one who's in trouble today if I muck up, because we sort of do some work with choosing wisely. And choosing wisely is about making good decisions around medical decision making. And my role, if you like, has been partly about, are they different decisions you need to make when we're talking about Māori health? Choosing wisely is about shutting down some pharmaceuticals, but there are some instances where we need to expand them for Māori because there's a lot of inequity going on in our system. Health Quality Safety Commission is doing something about unconscious bias, I believe. And so I was asked to talk about unconscious bias today. And I have to start off by saying I don't know much about unconscious bias. So that's my declarer to begin with. But what I do know is that unconscious bias is one of the ways of unpicking racism. Because racism is a nasty topic and it goes straight to the heart and sometimes there is some resistance. And when you put the word unconscious and when you think about bias, it kind of softens the argument and allows people to take a step back and think through what's happening. So what I want to do today is I don't have the solutions for what's going on, but I certainly want to be part of opening up the discussion. And thank you all for being here, because it's 70 people are here and 700 out there. So we know that there's a problem going on, don't we, Hush? Switch. There we go. We know that there's a problem going on because our man says so. So Meng from Gisborne, he says, yes, we're racist in quite a few areas in New Zealand, and he talks about unconscious bias as the issue. We also, well done, Hush, you're onto it. We also, but we think of, you know, we try and say, well, it's somebody else's problem, and it's in education. And certainly we know that schooling is really important for your kids and mine. And we all do things like we promote zoning systems so we don't get those other kids in our schools, that sort of stuff. And the MOE, the Ministry of Education, has come out talking about teachers and their unconscious bias. Or maybe we think it's in the police. And this was a really big one, this one. This councillor says, look, if they start putting more police with more guns on the streets, you can guarantee that more young brown men will get shot. And you can guarantee that this is going to happen. And he's saying it's all around implicit bias. It's not because policemen want to shoot young brown men, it's about implicit bias. And so this is a kind of a big topic, you know. But what about us in clinical medicine? And you'd be thinking that, no, we've spent years and years training and we are compassionate, wonderful people. But this one came up last year, and some of you will remember this. And this is kind of like little babies that, you know, prem babies up in NICU, and what do we discover, or what does the Mortality Review Committee discover? They discover that if you're brown, you're far less likely to be resuscitated than if you're white and only 22 weeks of gestation. And thanks, Hush. And they also, the Mortality Committee said, this is around implicit bias. So welcome to the world of implicit bias. Implicit bias, really important stuff. No, none of us have got a racist bone in our body. None of us men here have got any sexist attitudes. Welcome to implicit bias. And here's a great article by the Spin-Off that was written early this year. So the idea here is that can we use the language of implicit bias to explain racism, to talk about discrimination, kind of like in an inclusive manner and possibly without blame, in order that we can then sit down, talk this through and begin to facilitate change. Now, implicit bias is a big theoretical basis behind implicit bias. It's around this automatic tendency to stereotype on the basis of ethnicity, ability, gender, culture, religion, language. And, you know, when we do that, we then, because that's what we do for a living, we then make decisions about other people's lives. And, you know, your life and my life, they're kind of stressful lives. We have a lot of work on. We multitask. We've got short time. We're stressed. And some of us, especially the house surgeons, who are not here, I believe they're down the road doing their study group, are stressed and fatigued. And so the decisions that we make are kind of like this red arrow is supposed to say, didn't go through our conscious brain. It's a cognitive process that avoids our conscious mind, implicit or unconscious bias, and comes up with these sorts of decisions. So how does implicit bias come up when, you know, you and I are in our work lives? And this group of people here, that I've put up the title of their paper, which is down below here, but they said what we do is we become less, when we've got people who we have bias for, and I'm putting this up as one of the main reasons for Māori inequities in this country, we become less patient-centred, we become less proactive, we don't establish good rapport, we dominate the conversation, and you know, we're not as warm as we are with people who we have an affinity to, and we spend less time explaining things. And so what does the biasing do to the patient? It leaves the patients feeling unhappy, untrusting. They don't trust us. They rate us poorly. They don't, you know, they don't stick to the things that we discuss with them and advise them around. And of course, they're far less likely to come back to us. So, you know, in my last job, so yes, I was once a general practitioner with a public health degree. Now I'm a public health physician who used to be a general practitioner. But in my general practice and in my colleagues, these are all general practitioners, those researchers over there, they said that we spend less time with Māori patients, we do fewer investigations, we make a diagnosis less commonly, we do less interventions, we do less treatment, we do fewer referrals through to secondary, and when they get to secondary care, they have fewer interventions. And this is partly on the basis, different group of researchers, that we GPs, we think that Māoris are just, we think they're sick, and we think that they don't listen to us, and we think that they make bad choices around their lifestyle. In other words, it's not really our fault. So we know, don't we, that there are Māori health inequities across the life course, and you would think that, maybe you would think, but, thank you. But our bias, you know, we're not thinking about kids. Surely kids escape this thing. But remember this one, no kids don't escape this thing at all. In fact, if we have a look at things like access to antenatal care, access to antenatal care is very poor. It's much worse in deprived communities and much worse in Māori and Pacific communities. This graph across nationally shows it as 20% less. In Flaxmere, in Maraenui, I would think that that would be much, much bigger. So poor access to care, in this case to LMC. And this is the famous SIDS graph. Even though you can see this huge decrease in both the yellow, the green and the purple lines, with purple being Māori, over this time period, the disparity has remained at around about 5 or 6 and is still up there. So prevention services are not performing for Māori. And here we go, we're talking here about inhaled corticosteroid scripts. And what you can see is that if we've got one group of people, and this is in the younger group, 10% lower, but 10% is enough to make a difference in the admission rates. So 20% higher admission rates in Māori children at the younger end because of ICS prescriptions. If you look at primary care overall, and you have this thing called amenable mortality, and amenable mortality is that portion of death that is supposed to be preventable by good primary care, then you can see that the disparity is 2.5 times. It's huge. If we go into secondary care, just have a quick look here, we're 15% of the population, we make up 2/3 of those with kidney failure. We take up 1/3 of all the dialysis beds, but we've only got 10% of those who have transplant as first treatment. You know, that doesn't kind of make sense. We'll come back to that later. This one was quite good when I first found it. I mean, we're doing the transplants because I went to a transplant hui and they taught me some stuff. And now we're doing a little bit about radiation oncology because I was at their meeting 2 weeks ago. And you think, this is great. In radiation oncology, actually we get more service. Māori get more service than non-Māori in radiation oncology. But when you go and ask the question why, you find out that it's because the Māori patients don't get offered surgery quite so often. And yes, there are a whole bunch of reasons around it that we will follow up. But you know, these are things about Māori people in some way or form being systematically excluded from various forms of treatment. And of course, back to this one, you can't avoid this one because these are 22 to 24 weekers that we're talking about, and you know, at tertiary level, we're doing this sort of stuff. So the ministry said, these are kind of important, that these differences in health are avoidable, unfair, and unjust. And that's really important. They're preventable. They're definitely unfair, and they're frankly unjust. The Waitangi Tribunal, and I'll put this one up just to remind us that the Waitangi Tribunal in their report earlier this year said that these disparities have persisted over the 20 years since the Public Health and Disability Act in 2000. Of course, they were only talking about that 20-year period. Of course, these inequities have been around for a lot longer than that. My best friend, Whakatane Reid, some of you may know, she says that inequity is immoral. And we've got to have it more than just as an item on our strategic plan. So if we had a look and thought through what are some of the causes of Māori health inequities. Now, that wasn't what Taika Waititi was asked, but you know, this is a halfway reasonable answer. But I tried to get a better answer. And so trying to get a better answer, I went to the Institute of Medicine, and they had this diagram: health system factors, health patient or population factors, and health professional factors. So I stole their diagram, just like a good academic does, and changed it. And I said, well, health system, that's probably institutional racism. Patient or population is probably around poor social determinants of health. And health professional factors is around our cultural incompetence, our inability to deal well with this situation. So these are what I've put up as the causes of Māori health disabilities, and then we change it to inequities, thinking about the unavoidable, unfair and unjust things that the ministry has brought up for us. And then I have added historical trauma. So these are my 4 things. This is what I think is going on in our health system. And I thought what we might do is just have a wee look. So, historical trauma. Now, we don't do historical trauma very well in New Zealand. This is done in other countries, possibly because other countries had arguably bigger traumas than us. But this is taken from an American Indian group of researchers who said depression, self-destructive behavior, suicidal thoughts, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, difficulty talking this thing through. You hear this and you see this every day, don't you? You see patients like this all the time. There's growing New Zealand literature, a big New Zealand literature around this. As I say, it's not like overseas, but you know, we don't have a great history in this country. We do have a rather long, could I call it a civil war, when you've got one group of people with guns pointing them and shooting another group of people. And you know, if you went from the Waitangi massacre, in which case actually the Waitangi massacre, the Māoris massacred the non-Māoris, yes, so that was one, through to Maunga Pohatu, where Rua's son was shot. That's 77 years worth of armed conflict in this country. So we have a long history of armed conflict. We've got Rangi Alwhia. Rangi Alwhia is the church where Cameron's been, where the old people and the children went to the church to defend themselves, if you like. They set fire to the church and they shot the people as they came out. And of course, Parihaka, we all know Parihaka, and the story, the nastiness behind Parihaka is not so much the soldiers moving on to an unarmed group of people, but the mass rape of the women afterwards. And land is always an issue, and this is something that you may have seen before, the 1860s, the 1808, the 1960s, the black land representing land that Māori definitely have ownership on, and how quickly it falls away. Historical trauma around land, what we know around this sort of thing is, of course, this is about colonisation. Colonisation is about when one nation takes over another in order to get their hands on the resources of that country, and usually to repatriate them to the home country, as for instance with India. And I mention India because I've got a lot of international students at EIT, and they remind me that most colonists go home. I won't go on about that. Well, ours didn't go home, and so Ngata thought that we should fight for citizenship. And so he managed to get a whole bunch of people to go into the Māori battalion, who had the biggest casualties of any single unit in the Second World War except the Gurkhas. And when they came back, they expected, like other soldiers, to be able to get hold of repatriation funds. But actually they came back to find much of their own lands confiscated to give to the Pākehā soldiers who had come back. They also found themselves still not to be allowed in bars, and they got unemployment benefits that were lower than everybody else's. So I bring those things up not to whinge, but just to remind us that historical trauma is big, and we don't talk about it. And it's big, and it's an important part of how our patients and our clients and our populations and our communities are set up to begin to deal with people like us, who are kind of authority figures, if that's a good word. And so here's this picture of historical trauma, and it's not difficult to see how it leads to physical and mental illness, or predisposes you to being unwell, it predisposes you to being on the edge and ending up in prison. And of course, the big controversy in this country at the moment is the systematic uplift of Māori babies from home. And where's the worst place in the country? It's where I've just come from. It's in Hawke's Bay. So if I can get off that topic with just this mention that actually there's a whole lot of work going on in epigenetics that are saying that this stuff is now that they're now showing that this stuff is now almost genetically passed on from one generation to another. So this is a big area of work that's developing. If we go into cultural incompetence, much easier to deal with because it's cultural competence, if you like, is those attitudes and skills and knowledge that we need to be able to function effectively when we're dealing with people of another culture. And again, we sort of say, well, hello, is it me? Am I at fault here in some of this? Is it really me? Because, you know, I treat all my patients the same. And, you know, is it really my fault that they smoke, didn't take my pills, eat all that garbage, doesn't do exercise, or just comes in too late, or damn it, they've got bad genes, but it certainly is not me. So let's have a look back at that transplant thing, and let's figure out what happens in transplants and just throw our minds around. And this was a group of Māori associates who were working for the ministry at the time, and some renal physicians said, well, Māori patients have got to be deserving of a transplant. And you all know what deserving means. Deserving means coming to the appointments, doing what I say, taking the pills, stopping smoking, don't drink any alcohol, all those sorts of things. Worse, they describe them as naughty. So these are quotes out of their research. It's difficult patients. And so they have this group of difficult patients who they know don't get transplants, and yet they don't involve the cultural coordinators at the local hospital teams. They found that people like Kerry were not involved in the care of these people often. So, you know, when we look at our outcomes, what we find when we do audits, we find that ethnicity is the biggest determinant of inequity. And we should really go into these situations knowing that we're likely to treat patients inequitably. It's really important that we know that there's nobody in this room who gets up in the morning to do a shitty job. Yeah? And I don't think that's useful to be doing that, to be finger pointing. Nobody does that. But you know, you can do stuff. You can do stuff, and systems can do stuff, and these are a few of the things that that I've seen and been around. Ngāti and Healthy is a way of using tribal peoples, traditional foods, in order to work with people with pre-diabetes and to prevent the progression of diabetes. Here's the famous wahakura. How do you get rid of smoking when there is beach hearing in pregnancy as a risk factor? Well, you invent this thing and you stick the baby in the bed. I mean, this is sort of like radical and almost abnormal behaviour, but it seemed that it worked, and the ministry has now taken that on board. This one here about mahi atua. Mahi atua is a way of talking through and using creation myths as a way of grabbing hold of, in this case, mental health, people with mental health presentations, grabbing their attention, involving them in the discussion and keeping them coming back because it's interesting. So these are, this is another one in Hawke's Bay. It's called Ngātahi, and it's about, this was actually an unsuccessful one, but it's one that we were trying to figure out how do we teach people to engage more effectively with Māori, and in this case it was social workers, psychologists and counsellors and what have you. And we've been spectacularly unsuccessful with this go here. This one here, Te Ohakura, is about stopping smoking. And what do you do to up the ante in stopping smoking? Well, on the one hand, we're using vapes, and on the other hand, we're using this karakia. E te where koe te taku e taku atua, ohakura tia taku hau. By Māori. And if Māori women who are smoking and who have no vested interest in giving up smoking have got supportive workers on one side, a vape on the other side to deal with the nicotine, then perhaps the karakia is the thing that's going to deal with the state of mind and to help them through. Oh, this is my favourite. This is about boil up. So boil up is, you know, if you can get rid of the doughboys and you can get rid of the lots of potatoes and the white bread, then actually what you've got is meat and greens. And I'm seriously using that. We're seriously using this in pre-diabetes and in diabetes as a way of controlling high glucose. So once upon a time, we used to do cultural sensitivity in this country, and certainly when I was at medical school, when I was teaching at medical school, I was involved in teaching what we called cultural sensitivity. No, you didn't have to do it. Nobody examined it. It was all done on a one-to-one classrooms, but it was aimed at the individual. And it was kind of, the message was, you know, you could, if you really please do, be sensitive to Māori need. And then we, at the same time, cultural safety was around. And cultural safety was in the nursing schools. It was definitely mandatory. It looked at individuals and it looked at organisations, and it was an absolute. You must account for your professional outcomes, and for the nurses in here, you may remember those times. They were very heady days, because it was a very in-your-face approach, and it created a lot of controversy. Cultural safety, the Hapiti Ramsden, was really about looking at power relationships between patients and providers, and getting people to look at their own culture and the impact that their culture has on their interactions with patients, and how they could behave better, so to speak. Cultural competence, on the other hand, as a formal thing in the medical profession, sort of came in the 2000s with the Health Practitioner Competency Assurance Act, and the Medical Council moved in with their definitions of cultural competence. They moved it into CPD, they moved it in, we have MOPS points. The colleges are often looking at us, certainly the med schools are looking at us, and you've absolutely got to do this in exams. You've got to front up. But in fact, we've been doing this for a long time, this cultural competence stuff, and we haven't made any flipping difference at all in the inequities. So a short while ago, in 2016, Te Ora, the Māori Doctors Association and the New Zealand Medical Council of New Zealand, took on a project that was looking at cultural competence and the pursuit of equitable outcomes. And you're fast off the mark on that one, weren't you? And then this guy comes into the picture, doesn't he? And in 2017, he reintroduces the word equity into the health lexicon. So last government, no equity. This government, this is what we're after. And so on the basis of that, and on the basis of us also joining up with, thanks Harsh, the next one, joining up with the Council of Medical Colleges, we've now got this big program that has resulted in the writing of a piece of work, and this is this is now at the reviewers, and it should be published any day in the International Journal of Equity and Health, why cultural safety rather than cultural competency is required to achieve health equity. So you can bet your bottom dollar that the council, the medical council, is presently working on their statement, and that'll be out reasonably soon. If we look at the social determinants of health, then what we, social determinants of health, we won't talk about the definition because you all know it, but it's said that part of that is about access to care, and here's this 20% that they talk about. But actually, if you look at the other things, then you can see that the one about the physical environment, well, that's huge in illness, housing, local environment. If you think about health behaviours, then we know that risk profiles are absolutely predicted by your socioeconomic status. The whole thing, poor people smoke. Used to be rich people smoke. Used to be doctors and rich people smoke. Now it's poor people, brown people. And as soon as these poor brown people in New Zealand stop smoking, well, it's starting now, the companies are going after poor peoples in Asian countries, in African countries. And so there's this sort of evil thing going around the world. I've got to get off that topic. And then of course the socioeconomic factors around health literacy and around if you can't afford it, this thing about access, if you can't afford the care or you can't get the care, or actually you're working 2 or 3 jobs, and so you simply don't have time to go to the clinics when you and I run our services. So of course these people show up at ED because we're closed. The rest of us are closed. So I'm thinking that actually the social determinants are really all about predetermined health status and poor access to care. And then institutional racism. Well, institutional racism where institutions produce outcomes that systematically put already disadvantaged groups at further disadvantage. And there are 3 racisms that Kamara Jones talks about. So she talks about personally mediated racism. And personally mediated racism is that, so here's me and I live over here, and down 3 houses down the road, there's a family whose children are blonde. And I have a bias. I've got blondism. So that's prejudice. I don't like those blonde kids. Now, when I don't let those blonde kids come to my daughter's or my granddaughter's birthday party, that's discrimination. So that's acting on my bias, is discrimination. But when I say in my local childcare centre that we will not admit people with blue eyes, and you know that those blonde kids are far more likely to have blue eyes than anybody else in this neighbourhood, then that becomes institutional racism. So institutional racism is about the differential access to goods and services and the opportunities of our society. And of course, when those poor blonde kids down the road and their parents start to think, oh gosh, I don't think that we should send our kids down to that birthday party. We won't even bother trying to get in because actually we're not good enough. That's when you take this thing on board, and that's what happens inside racist societies, that people begin to think that they actually are what everybody says they are. So, we know that there's racism around. We know that the Ministry of Health says that we have racism and we have discrimination in our services, and we have this institutional prejudice. We remind ourselves that the Waitangi tribunals out there, they say that we've got it, they use the words, it really does exist. The Mortality Review Committee, they blamed implicit bias, but they also talked about racism. So we need to get used to this. So we go back to care and we think about those transplants. The reason why Māori people don't get transplants is because you've got to have a BMI less than 35. Now, if you remember, if you know anything about New Zealand and our obesity problem, then you can be flipping sure that there's a whole bunch of people, Māori people, who need a kidney who are not going to get one because they don't have a BMI of less than 35. And the other thing is that they're not doing this for diabetics. And of course, these people with end-stage renal failure, they are diabetics. Same thing goes with for radiation. BMI is a major criteria for whether you get surgery or not. So I'm sorry, you've got a BMI of 40, we're not going to operate on you, you get the radiation oncology. We know that surgery is a much better treatment, you're going to survive, you've got a better chance of survival, but no, we're not going to do you, you get the other treatment. And of course, if you've got any form of comorbidity, then you've got far less chance of getting those interventions. So these are criteria, if you like. We are disadvantaged by criteria, and you might say, is this institutional racism or is this unconscious bias? Whatever it is, people are disadvantaged by a set of criteria, and when we go back and we measure them, we see inequity. So what are we going to do? Well, I think what we've got to do is we've got to be in review mode. And this is about reviewing personal behaviour. It's about reviewing your team's behaviour. It's about reviewing your colleges and your training people's behaviour. It's about reviewing your institution's behaviour. It's about standing up and being counted. And it goes, it starts really simply. You know, can you pronounce your Māori patients' names? So Ned Koia Urutarangi, Ned knows that I use his name. He was my patient. Koia Urutarangi is a flash name. It means that person who was able to ascend into the heavens. It's a tapu name, if you like. It's a rangatira name, Koia Urutarangi. And the first time that I saw Ned, because I don't use their surnames, I'm called out, I use his surname purposefully, because I knew he had never had his name pronounced correctly by anybody except his mother. And I was right. You should have seen this guy beam. Of course, he was my favourite. Well, I was his favourite doctor since forever. And you know, you just can't know how important that is. Every time someone calls me Dr. Tipene or Dr. Tipens, or just can't, I just don't go there. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it's really important, and it's not difficult. It's not difficult. And so if there was one thing that you went away from this thing, it's about, I've got to learn how to pronounce Māori names. If you can get the Māori vowels, then you can get most of the Pacific vowels. If you can get the Māori and Pacific vowels, you can get most of, not East European, I can't do East European, but you can get many of the Indian vowels, you can get many of the Sri Lankan vowels, and it just makes it so much easier to do. And you get the name, you win the patient. And this whole thing about whānau, you know, we still have situations, don't we, where we're saying, oh God, they've got 10 people in there. What are we going to do? Well, look, I say, all you want to do is take their bloody temperature, get in there and hang in there with them. So, you know, we still have trouble dealing with the whānau situation. This is not rocket science stuff we're talking about here. You know, maybe the next bit's a little bit of rocket science about, do you really understand the treaty issues? Have you really had a go at thinking that through? Are you actually doing any cultural competence training? Do you do anything more than the 5% of training that the College of General Practitioners demands? And most importantly, and this is really important, that you actually look at your outcomes. I didn't mean that you edit them, I meant that you audit them. But you audit your outcomes by ethnicity so that you can see what's happening with your patients. You know, Māori language is popular these days. It seems that all the wānanga are running out of spaces, and everybody's running out of spaces. Everyone wants to do this. And so, you know, maybe that's what we should, maybe you should have your own Māori language class here at Hutt Valley DHB. Treaty training. Treaty training's out there, it's all over the place. Māori don't do treaty training these days. Once upon a time we used to. We were not good at treaty training because we came into it with hang-ups. Treaty training in this day and age is almost completely done by Pākehā people who see the issues, who understand the issues, and who are able to, you know, sit through and talk us through without getting peeved about the situation. Cultural competence training, I mean, it's out there all over the place. You can get cultural competence training online. If you think, well, you know, what are my biases? You can go to the Harvard site and you can do implicit bias testing online. And you can figure out whether you're biased against Indian people, people with BMIs, blonde people with blue eyes. You can put the figures in, they bring up the test, and you can figure what's going on for yourself. This one here was this was me trying to advertise. Actually, all you've got to do is learn how to say hello in another language, and you're going to be a winner. A proper name and a decent greeting, and it's going to be a winner. But you've got to do the same thing with your team. These are really the same questions, aren't they? Does your team, does other people in your team, do they do, so you're good at it, but what does the receptionist say? Well, the receptionist is good at it, and how good are you? What about the nurse? And what about the OT? Us. So, you know, these are really, the whole team's really important. And the fact that we make our clinics, our whole clinic, whānau friendly, those sorts of things. And does our team model equity? Do we understand equity? Do we look at the outcomes? Do we support the Māori workforce? Do we try and get Māori people on our staff? And again, do we report our outcomes by ethnicity? So some DHBs, for instance, have taken this really on board. And this is a report from Whanganui DHB, where they did a pro-equity checkup with Gabrielle and Bryn Jones. And you know, this is easy to do stuff. You can get this looked at organisation level. And so lastly, these are the same things again for your college and for your employer, and asking those same questions. Have we got equity up there as a major thing? What are we doing about cultural competence training? Do we look at all our outcomes? Do we need to bring in people from the outside? How do we do the appropriate research so we know what's going on and those sorts of things? So in summary, people, this is about talking about our biases and being okay to talk about these things and looking at our behaviours in order to explain some of the outcomes that we all have in our practice. Because I just go back here, because nobody wakes up in the morning to do a bad job. And sometimes, and this is going on with social workers at the moment in Hawke's Bay, sometimes people throw bad stuff at you because they're angry and because they don't understand that we don't wake up in the morning to do a bad job. So, koe nā noho nā kōrero, hei te mihi atua ki a tātou katoa. Good luck with this, and maybe what we've got here is a beginning of a conversation for a group of people who were bothered to ask to move forward on this topic. Nō reira, kia ora rātai.
And if not, then I'd just really like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for your audio. I think you've raised some really valid and vital points about actually where we're at in terms of our system. One of the things that I really noticed was that the work that we're doing, so we launched our Māori Health Strategy in July. And so there's a Kiwi that actually raised it. Understanding what our data is, understanding what happens now, and being able to input from a personal perspective and a personal level. I guess it's something that you really inspired was that we all can do something. So there is absolutely something that each individual in here can do and collectively to ensure that we change the system and that we can meet the needs, the health needs of Māori across. So just making to you again, thank you. One little quick story I'll just share with you is, and I really respect Dr. David, when Harsh contacted him originally to ask him if he would come down and do the 40 law, And that's what I really thought, that it's just such a man who stands in his values and beliefs. So when Harsh first asked him if he would come down and do the audit, or he said to Harsh, you know, tell me what you want to get out of this kind of a thing. Basically, convince me why I should come down here and do this, and this just won't be another talk that people just come and sit and listen and nod and say okay, and then walk back to their desk and carry on just doing the same thing. And I really respected that about Dr. David, because what it does is it recognises that actually what he wants to do is share the message for people who want to change, and for systems to want to change. So, kia ora to you. We'll just give another round of applause.
Just have to say about the lack of questions. Once upon a time, see, I'm a student, like many of you were, and our teachers always used to say, it's always good to ask questions. It shows that you've been listening. But actually, most often, when you do talks like this, I find that no one asks questions. And I think that it's appropriate. I think that, you know, I just threw a lot of shit at it. And, you know, it's about sitting back and taking some of that stuff in. These ones will have a copy of the presentation, should you be in any way interested. I believe Sue is, somebody's been filming this, haven't they?
I think it was Hutch.
Yeah.
I advertised it.
You advertised it. But look, it's been great to be here, and thank you for putting up all those seats, and thank you, Harsh. It was worth coming. Well done. Kia ora tata.
Oh, so sorry, we haven't finished. So we have Sue from Choosing Wisely, who's just going to give a little 2-minute talk. So Sue has worked in the health and not-for-profit sectors for most of her working life, and now works as a consultant in the health and regulatory sectors. Until recently, Sue was Executive Director for the Council of Medical Colleges and is now working for CNC, facilitating the Choosing Wisely campaign. Currently, Sue is a member of 2 professional regulatory bodies and assists several health boards for complaint investigations. So Sue's just going to give a quick update of some of the money that she's been doing. So
Kia ora. Thank you, everyone. And David, that was a marvellous speech. And yes, I think you stand us the time. We all need to reflect and think about the impact on ourselves. So, kia ora. I'm here today, that wasn't full of coffee, just to talk a little bit about Choosing Wisely and how that works with the equity lens. And hopefully if I flick this, how are you doing that, Harsh? Thank you. Which one? That one. So, as I think you all know, Choosing Wisely is a campaign about decreasing treatments. Oh yes, so you don't see all my comments down below. And basically it is an international campaign, so we're working with people internationally. So clearly we were challenged quite early on, but this is New Zealand. We are working with Māori. Is this the right campaign? You haven't worked in partnership with us. How are you going to change the campaign to be more effective within New Zealand? Because it is known that often healthcare campaigns and interventions are taken up more by the middle class, by those with the most resources. And as the little graph, which I'm sure you've all seen these little cartoony pictures, you know, the reality is a certain group of our society is probably going to gain from this, but not everybody. And so therefore we were challenged with what are we going to do? And basically the few things we have done, we've done quite a lot of research. We used a tool used in the Ministry of Health called the HEAT tool to look at that campaign and see how it sat within New Zealand. And we've done a few things. So one of them was, we've said to all the people developing Choosing Wisely recommendations, one thing we want you to do now is to make sure you choose recommendations that have the most power or the most information to reduce inequities in New Zealand. We want you to look at the recommendations you already have to make sure they don't have an impact on health inequities. And I mean, an obvious one was I think it was the College of Infectious Disease. Sorry, I haven't got the name right, but those of you in the room that belong to the college, excuse me. But basically, we had the obvious. Don't use antibiotics for viral infections. But we all know that Māori, especially Māori young people who may end with rheumatic fever, that is not an appropriate recommendation just to apply across the board. So we now have changed that recommendation, and a different recommendation is on our website. The same, for example, in the treatment of gout and what treatments are gout. So we've gone through the list now, and we've asked the colleges to go through the list to review all the recommendations with an equity lens. You probably also know this, and I think David touched on it. This research comes from Health Quality Safety and their review of patient outcomes. And basically, Māori consumers consistently say they're less likely to understand what the doctor said. They have a condition explained to them in a way they couldn't understand and they couldn't ask. And they always feel that doctors and nurses they don't always feel that doctors and nurses listen to what they say. This is reality. I mean, this was actually a questionnaire given to Māori patients. So we've got to start understanding the Māori worldview. And I think the cartoon here shows exactly what David says. We can't treat everyone the same. Because if we treat everyone the same, we're not going to get any better off. So I suppose the best thing we've done in this space is we've done a partnership with Te Ora, and with the guidance of David, we have developed a research program. So we are currently funding this research program. We have Anna Adcock of Victoria University, and she's going to look at shared decision making, because as well as recommendations for choosing wisely, the other side is to improve clinicians and patients' shared decision making. If we know that clinicians do not talk well with Māori, and clinicians do not actually talk face to face, eye to eye, or understanding to understanding, how can we make it better? So Anna's doing some literature review, she's doing some qualitative interviews with Māori, and she's finally going to come up with some recommendations and strategies for choosing wisely to take forward. So we hope in the end that we will be able to improve choosing wisely. It's been a little interesting dealing with this on the international forum, because I'm not sure everyone in Choosing Wisely International understands what we're talking about. But I have to say, we have now been accepted at a speaking at the Preventing Overdiagnosis Conference in Sydney in a couple of weeks' time. We've been accepted at the Choosing Wisely International Forum. Dr. Bonning did 2 or 3 talks on equity. So I think basically things are beginning to move in this space, and hopefully we will be able to impact on the Choosing Wisely campaign. And that's all I really had to say, but I thought you might be just very interested in this start. We're nearly 3 years old in New Zealand, Choosing Wisely. When we started, we had no projects in DHB we knew about. We now know about 110. We've got about 18 DHBs doing some work in Choosing Wisely. We've got lots of supporting organisations. We've got 32 of the colleges and associations on board. And we've got a large number of patient resources. So we're going from strength to strength. Thank you. Thank you.
So just to say a big thank you to Sue for giving us an update on the work that Choosing Wisely is doing. Overall, I'd also just like to mention Harsh and really say thank you to Harsh for organising the event today. It's been really enlightening, and it's good for our DHB. I know 2 weeks ago we had Anton doing an audit on unconscious bias. So it's good for our DHB to actually continue this work and continue to unpack and understand what this looks like for us so that we can make a difference. So thank you, Harsh, for doing that, and of course for Sister Ruatoki, your lead in the Choosing Wisely campaign. Thank you very much. So that is the end of our session today. So I just want to thank everybody for coming along, and hopefully you'll go back. Not hopefully, sorry. Hope's not a plan. I learned a couple of weeks ago. So we challenge you to go back and actually change something that you're doing with the new information that you've learned today. And like Dr. David said, this is an opportunity for collectively for us to look at how we can do some work together. So let's challenge each other to get that working as well. So kia ora koutou.
It's not a this is and another one